Welcome to the Classic Books Reimagined channel. This is part 3 of the audiobook Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice is the second novel by English author Jane Austen, originally published in 1813. It is a novel of manners that follows the character development of Elizabeth Bennet, the protagonist who learns about the repercussions of hasty judgments and comes to appreciate the difference between superficial goodness and actual goodness. It has become one of the most popular novels in English literature, with over 20 million copies sold, and has inspired many derivatives in modern literature. In this audiobook, the original Pride and Prejudice has been reimagined as if it had been originally written by best-selling New York Times and USA Today author Carolyn Brown. Carolyn Brown has written more than 100 novels and 8 novellas and contributed to multiple anthologies selling more than 6 million copies. We hope you enjoy this classic book, Reimagined. Please like this video, subscribe to this channel, and tell us what you like about this reimagined book, or what you think we need to do better next time. Thanks for watching and listening.
Mrs. Gardiner took Lizzie aside, choosing a quiet moment to share her concerns with a gentle honesty that Lizzie always respected. "Lizzie, you're too sharp to fall for someone just because folks say you shouldn't. So I'll just lay it out straight. Be careful with Mr. Wickham. Don't let yourself or him get too tangled up without thinking about how the money side of things could complicate your future." Lizzie, always quick with a quip, replied with a light-hearted air, "Oh, Aunt, you're getting all serious on me." Her aunt nodded. "I am, and for good reason." Lizzie reassured her with a smile. "Don't worry, I'll keep an eye on both our hearts. He won't be falling for me if I can help it." Mrs. Gardiner wasn't fully convinced by Lizzie's nonchalance. "Now, don't dodge me, Lizzie. If he really gets attached, and heaven forbid you do too, it'd be better if he didn't." Lizzie tried again, more sincerely this time. "Honestly, Aunt, I'm not lost to Mr. Wickham, far from it, but he sure is a charming man. Still, I see where it could lead and the mess it might make, especially with Mr. Darcy stirring up trouble. I won't let you down, or Papa either." "That's my girl," her aunt said, with a relieved smile. "Maybe keep him from coming around too much, too. No need to stir the pot by inviting him over all the time." Lizzie laughed, remembering her recent machinations. "Guilty as charged, but I'll cool it. Can't promise he won't be around with Mom playing matchmaker for the county." With a promise to be wise, Lizzie left her aunt feeling a bit better about the whole thing. As for Mr. Collins, his move to the Lucas place kept him out of Mrs. Bennet's hair as his wedding day neared, and while Mrs. Bennet's well-wishers were grudging at best, Lizzie felt a pang of regret for her mother's lack of grace. Charlotte, soon to be Mrs. Collins, stopped by to say her farewells, and Lizzie couldn't help but feel embarrassed by her mother's lackluster blessing. As Charlotte prepared to leave, she made Lizzie promise to visit her soon, a promise Lizzie gave despite her reservations about the joy such a visit would bring. The wedding went off without a hitch, and Charlotte settled into her new life, writing to Lizzie of her contentment with her home, her neighbourhood, and even Lady Catherine. Lizzie read between the lines, knowing she'd have to see it all for herself to understand the full picture. Back in London, Jane was facing her own disappointments. Weeks passed with no word from Mr. Bingley, and when Jane finally saw Caroline again, the chill in the air was unmistakable. Jane's hope that Caroline's coldness was just an oversight was crushed by the reality of her friend's indifference. In her letter to Lizzie, Jane confessed she had been completely wrong about Caroline's affections. Lizzie felt a sting for her sister, but wasn't surprised. She'd always doubted Caroline's sincerity. Despite everything, Jane remained forgiving, not willing to think ill of anyone, not even those who had hurt her. As Lizzie shared these trials with Mrs. Gardiner, she reflected on her own brush with romance. Mr. Wickham had moved on to a more lucrative prospect, and Lizzie found herself relieved rather than heartbroken. She admitted to her aunt that whatever she'd felt for Wickham, it wasn't love, not the kind that leaves you shattered. "Looks like neither Wickham nor Bingley is going to disrupt our lives too much," Lizzie concluded, a touch of dry humour in her voice. "And that might just be for the best. After all, a little peace and quiet can sometimes be worth more than all the romantic dramas in the world." Chapter 27. New Horizons. As January and February quietly passed by, the Longbourn family found themselves wrapped in the routine of walks to Meryton, sometimes muddied, sometimes chilled. But come March, Elizabeth's horizon expanded as she prepared for her journey to Hunsford. Initially, the trip hadn't weighed heavily on her mind, but Charlotte's reliance on the plan and the prospect of reuniting with her dear friend kindled a growing excitement within her. The prospect of leaving home, even for a short while, offered a welcome change from the monotony of Longbourn life, especially with a mother whose matchmaking schemes knew no bounds and sisters who often failed to provide true companionship. Thus, the journey promised a refreshing novelty, heightened by the chance to catch a glimpse of Jane. As the departure date drew near, Elizabeth's anticipation only grew. The plan, meticulously sketched by Charlotte, soon included a stopover in London, a delightful addition that added a touch of adventure to the excursion. Despite her father's reluctance to see her go, Elizabeth was determined to make the most of the opportunity, assuring him of regular correspondence. Parting ways with Mr. Wickham was bittersweet, his friendly demeanour serving as a reminder of their past interactions. His well wishes and genuine interest in her future endeared him to her even more, leaving her with a lasting admiration for his amiable nature. The journey itself, however, proved less enchanting than Elizabeth had hoped. Accompanied by Sir William Lucas and his daughter Maria, the hours passed in idle chatter that failed to capture Elizabeth's attention. Their mundane conversations paled in comparison to the lively banter she shared with her father or the intellectual discourse she craved. Arriving in Gracechurch Street, Elizabeth was greeted by Jane's radiant smile, a sight that warmed her heart after the dreary journey. Surrounded by the joyous clamour of her younger cousins, Elizabeth felt a sense of belonging and contentment wash over her, banishing any lingering weariness from the day's travels. In the comfort of her aunt's company, Elizabeth eagerly inquired about Jane's well-being, her concern tempered by Mrs. Gardiner's reassuring updates. However, the news of Miss Bingley's visit and Jane's subsequent reflections on their acquaintance left Elizabeth saddened, but not surprised. She had long suspected Miss Bingley's true intentions, and felt a pang of sympathy for her sister's disappointment. As the evening wore on, Elizabeth engaged her aunt in a spirited debate over Mr. Wickham's recent actions, defending his character against any accusations of mercenary motives. Their lively exchange reflected Elizabeth's unwavering loyalty to those she held dear, even in the face of scepticism. But amidst the laughter and conversation, a new adventure awaited Elizabeth, a summer tour of pleasure with her beloved uncle and aunt. The prospect of exploring the lakes filled her with unbridled excitement, offering a welcome distraction from the complexities of romance and society. With renewed vigour and anticipation, Elizabeth embraced the promise of new horizons, eager to embark on an adventure that would reshape her perspective and fill her heart with joy. Chapter 28. A Country Stroll and Unexpected Encounters. Every little detail of the upcoming day's journey was fresh and exciting to Elizabeth, her spirits soaring with anticipation. She had seen her sister looking as healthy as a peach, erasing any worries about her well-being, and the thought of their trip north filled her with constant joy. As they veered off the main road onto the lane leading to Hunsford, all eyes scanned the landscape in search of the parsonage, each twist and turn promising a glimpse of their destination. Rosings Park's fence marked their boundary on one side, triggering memories of all the tales Elizabeth had heard about its residents. Finally, the parsonage came into view. The garden gently sloped towards the road, the house nestled within it, green fences and a laurel hedge signalling their arrival. Mr. Collins and Charlotte emerged at the door, and the carriage halted at the small gate, greeted by nods and smiles all around. In the blink of an eye, they were out of the chaise, joyfully reuniting. Mrs. Collins welcomed her friend with genuine delight, and Elizabeth couldn't help but feel warmed by such a heartfelt reception. It was clear that her cousin's demeanour hadn't changed since his marriage. His polite formality remained intact, and he lingered at the gate, eager for news about her family. With no delay, Save for his brief comment on the neatness of the entrance, they were ushered into the house. Once inside the parlour, Mr. Collins ceremoniously welcomed them again to his humble abode, faithfully echoing all his wife's offers of refreshment. Elizabeth was prepared to witness Mr. Collins in his element, subtly trying to make her regret her rejection. Despite the neat and cosy surroundings, she couldn't muster any regretful sighs. Instead, she marvelled at Charlotte's cheerful demeanour in the company of such a companion. Throughout their visit, Mr. Collins took great pride in showcasing every corner of the house and extolling its virtues, seemingly addressing Elizabeth directly, as if to remind her of what she had passed up. Yet, despite his efforts, she couldn't help but wonder at her friend's ability to maintain such cheerfulness in his company. Whenever Mr. Collins said something cringeworthy, which was often, Elizabeth couldn't help but glance at Charlotte. Though she caught a faint blush once or twice, Charlotte wisely chose not to hear. After admiring every piece of furniture in the room and recounting their journey and London adventures, Mr. Collins suggested a stroll in the garden. He took immense pride in its upkeep, leading the way through every path and crossing, eagerly awaiting their praises. Every vista was meticulously pointed out, leaving aesthetics far behind. He could count the fields in every direction and enumerate the trees in the most distant grove. But of all the views, none could rival the sight of Rosings, framed by the trees opposite his house. While Mr. Collins was eager to show off his 2 meadows, the ladies, lacking proper shoes for the frosty ground, turned back. As Sir William accompanied him, Charlotte took Elizabeth and her sister on a tour of the house, likely glad for the chance to show it off without her husband's assistance. Though small, the house was well built and cosy, with everything arranged with Charlotte's trademark neatness and consistency. When Mr. Collins faded into the background, a sense of comfort permeated the space, and Elizabeth couldn't help but think that he must often slip from Charlotte's mind. As they dined, talk turned to Hertfordshire news, rehashing what had already been written. Alone in her room later that evening, Elizabeth reflected on Charlotte's contentment, her adeptness at managing her husband, and her calm demeanour. It was all handled with such finesse. She also pondered what their visit would entail, the usual routines, the inevitable interruptions from Mr. Collins, and the social engagements at Rosings. Her imagination painted a vivid picture of what lay ahead. Midday on the following day, as Elizabeth was getting ready for a walk, a sudden commotion downstairs caught her attention. Someone was running up the stairs in a frenzy, calling out loudly. Opening her door, she met Maria on the landing, breathless and agitated, urging her to hurry down to the dining room for an extraordinary sight. Elizabeth's questions were met with evasions. Maria would reveal nothing more. Rushing downstairs, they found 2 ladies in a low phaeton at the garden gate. "And is this all?" Elizabeth exclaimed, expecting a more eventful scene. "I thought at least the pigs had gotten into the garden, but it's only Lady Catherine and her daughter." "Oh, my dear," Maria corrected her, "it's not Lady Catherine. The elderly lady is Mrs. Jenkinson, who lives with them. The other is Miss de Bourgh. Just look at her. She's so petite. Who would have thought she could be so thin and small?" "She looks quite sickly and sour," Elizabeth remarked, her mind wandering elsewhere. "Yes, she'll suit him perfectly. She'll make him a very suitable wife." As Mr. Collins and Charlotte conversed with the visitors at the gate, Sir William stood in the doorway, enraptured by the grandeur before him, constantly bowing whenever Miss de Bourgh glanced his way. Eventually, there was nothing more to be said. The ladies departed, and the others returned inside. Mr. Collins wasted no time in congratulating the girls on their good fortune, as Charlotte revealed that they were invited to dine at Rosings the next day. Chapter 29. A Visit to Rosings. Mr. Collins basked in the glory of Lady Catherine's invitation, relishing the opportunity to showcase her grandeur to his awestruck guests. The swift invitation to dine at Rosings, extended to the entire party, surpassed even his expectations, leaving him in a state of bewildered admiration for Lady Catherine's condescension. Sir William, with his knowledge of the ways of the great, offered little surprise at the grand gesture. Having rubbed shoulders with the aristocracy, he understood the nuances of their refined manners, a perspective he imparted to his companions throughout the day and into the next morning. The impending visit to Rosings dominated conversation, with Mr. Collins diligently preparing his guests for the opulence they would encounter. His reassurance to Elizabeth regarding attire reflected his own misguided understanding of Lady Catherine's expectations, a misconception Elizabeth met with a knowing smile. Amidst Mr. Collins's fervent instructions, Maria Lucas found herself overwhelmed by the prospect of meeting Lady Catherine, her trepidation mirroring her father's anxiety at his own presentation at St. James's S. Yet Elizabeth, undaunted by the intimidating aura surrounding Lady Catherine, approached the visit with calm resolve. Their journey through the park, though pleasant, failed to elicit the expected enthusiasm from Elizabeth, who remained unimpressed by Mr. Collins's attempts to highlight the estate's grandeur. Arriving at Rosings, Maria's anxiety intensified, while even Sir William struggled to maintain his composure. Lady Catherine's imposing presence did little to ease their nerves, her authoritative demeanour reinforcing the vast gulf between their stations. Yet Elizabeth, unaffected by the grandiosity, calmly observed the scene before her, noting Lady Catherine's likeness to Mr. Darcy and Mr. Bore's frail appearance. Throughout the visit, Lady Catherine's domineering manner left little room for conversation, her every word delivered with unwavering authority. Yet Elizabeth, unfazed by her ladyship's airs, responded to her inquiries with composed grace, her composure standing in stark contrast to Maria's discomfort. As dinner commenced, Mr. Collins revelled in his proximity to Lady Catherine, his effusive praise mirrored by Sir William's subdued admiration. The lack of conversation at the table did little to alleviate the tension, with Elizabeth finding solace in her own thoughts amidst the stifling atmosphere. Retreating to the drawing-room, the ladies found themselves subjected to Lady Catherine's relentless discourse, her opinions delivered with unwavering certainty. Elizabeth, undaunted by her ladyship's probing questions, met each inquiry with polite indifference, much to Lady Catherine's surprise. As the evening drew to a close, Elizabeth found herself the subject of Lady Catherine's scrutiny, her refusal to divulge her age a testament to her resolve. Yet even in the face of Lady Catherine's imposing presence, Elizabeth remained steadfast, unwilling to yield to her ladyship's expectations. With the departure of the guests, Elizabeth was called upon to recount her impressions of Rosings, her diplomatic response offering little satisfaction to Mr. Collins's insatiable need for praise. Yet, as they bid farewell to Rosings, Elizabeth's thoughts lingered on the peculiarities of their visit, leaving her with a newfound appreciation for the complexities of aristocratic society. Chapter 30. Gentlemanly Convictions and Unexpected Guests. Sir William's visit to Hunsford lasted only a week, but it was enough to assure him that his daughter was as comfortable as a pig in sunshine. Mr. Collins, ever the dutiful son-in-law, made sure to take Sir William out every morning in his gig, showing off the beautiful countryside. Once Sir William left, life at the parsonage returned to normal, and Elizabeth was thankful to see less of her cousin. Mr. Collins now spent most of his time between breakfast and dinner either tending his garden or engrossed in reading and writing in his book-room that overlooked the road. At first, Elizabeth wondered why Charlotte didn't prefer using the dining parlour, as it was a larger room with a more pleasant view. But she soon realised Charlotte's cleverness. If they used a livelier room, Mr. Collins would have spent much less time in his own quarters. Elizabeth gave Charlotte full credit for her thoughtful arrangement. From the drawing-room, they couldn't see much of the lane, relying on Mr. Collins to inform them of passing carriages, particularly Mr. Bore's frequent trips in her phaeton. Though Mr. Bore occasionally stopped for a brief chat with Charlotte, she rarely got out. Mr. Collins visited Rosings nearly every day, often with Charlotte in tow. It wasn't until Elizabeth considered the possibility of other family livings that she understood their frequent visits. They dined at Rosings about twice a week. Despite Sir William's absence and the limited entertainment of one card table, each dinner was much like the first. Their other social engagements were few, as the neighbourhood's lifestyle was beyond the Collinses' reach. Elizabeth didn't mind, finding enjoyment in pleasant conversations with Charlotte and the lovely weather outdoors. Her favourite walk was along the open grove bordering the park. While the others visited Lady Catherine, Elizabeth found a sheltered path that seemed overlooked by everyone but herself, providing a peaceful escape from Lady Catherine's prying eyes. Thus, the first fortnight of her visit passed quickly. As Easter approached, the week promised a significant addition to the Rosings household. Shortly after her arrival, Elizabeth learned that Mr. Darcy would be visiting soon. Though she preferred the company of many others, Mr. Darcy's presence added novelty to their gatherings. Elizabeth looked forward to witnessing Miss Bingley's futile attempts to win his affection, as Lady Catherine had spoken highly of him with great satisfaction and admiration. The parsonage eagerly awaited Mr. Darcy's arrival. Mr. Collins spent the morning watching the lodge gates for any sign of him. When the carriage finally appeared, he hurried home with the news. The next morning he rushed to Rosings to pay his respects, accompanied by Lady Catherine's two nephews, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam, the latter being the younger son of Mr. Darcy's uncle, Lord. This unexpected honour surprised everyone. Charlotte, having seen them from her husband's room, informed the girls of the impending visit, crediting Elizabeth for Mr. Darcy's prompt arrival. Before Elizabeth could disclaim any credit, the doorbell announced their guests. The gentlemen entered, with Colonel Fitzwilliam leading the way. He was a gentleman in every sense, about 30, not conventionally handsome, but possessing the demeanour of a true gentleman. Mr. Darcy, unchanged from his Hertfordshire days, greeted Mrs. Collins with his usual reserve. Though his feelings toward Elizabeth's friend were unclear, he appeared composed. Elizabeth offered a simple curtsy without speaking. Colonel Fitzwilliam immediately engaged in conversation, displaying the ease and grace of a well-mannered man. Meanwhile, Mr. Darcy, after briefly commenting on the house and garden to Mrs. Collins, sat silently for a while. Eventually, he inquired about Elizabeth's family's health, to which she responded in the customary manner. She then casually mentioned her sister's extended stay in town, closely observing Mr. Darcy's reaction. Though she knew he had never encountered her sister, she hoped to detect any awareness of Jane's past interactions with the Bingleys. Mr. Darcy's slight confusion in his response suggested he was indeed oblivious to the matter. With no further pursuit of the subject, the gentlemen soon departed. Chapter 31. A charming evening at Rosings. Colonel Fitzwilliam's charm was the talk of the parsonage, and the ladies agreed he brightened every gathering at Rosings with his presence. Yet it took nearly a week after the gentlemen's arrival before they got an invite to Lady Catherine's stately home. It wasn't until Easter Sunday, following the church service, that they were casually invited to spend the evening at Rosings. In the past week they hadn't seen much of Lady Catherine or her daughter. Colonel Fitzwilliam, however, made a few pleasant stops at the parsonage. Mr. Darcy, in contrast, they only glimpsed at church. The invitation, naturally, was accepted, and they joined the evening's gathering at the appointed time. Lady Catherine received them with polite detachment, clearly favouring her nephew's company over anyone else's. Her attention was particularly focused on Mr. Darcy, much to the neglect of other guests. Colonel Fitzwilliam, on the other hand, seemed genuinely pleased to see them. Rosings hardly offered him any respite, and Mrs. Collins's lovely friend had particularly caught his eye. He quickly took a seat next to her, engaging her in lively conversation about everything from local travels to recent books and music. Elizabeth found his company more entertaining than any previous visit had afforded, and their animated discussion even drew the curious glances of Lady Catherine and Mr. Darcy. Mr. Darcy's interest was piqued often enough that Lady Catherine couldn't help but intervene. "What are you chatting about, Fitzwilliam? What's the topic? Do tell us all," she demanded. "We were discussing music, madam," Colonel Fitzwilliam explained, unable to dodge her inquiry any longer. "Music? Then please share with us," Lady Catherine insisted. Music is a passion of mine, and I insist on being part of this conversation." She went on to express her confidence that, had her daughter Anne's health permitted, she would have been a remarkable musician. Mr. Darcy, when asked, praised his sister Georgiana's musical talents, to which Lady Catherine promptly reminded him of the importance of practice, a lesson she often shared with any young lady within earshot. The evening progressed, and as coffee was served, Colonel Fitzwilliam reminded Elizabeth of her earlier promise to play for him. She sat at the pianoforte immediately, and he positioned himself close enough to have an unobstructed view of her as she played. Lady Catherine listened briefly before returning to converse with Mr. Darcy, but his attention remained fixed on Elizabeth. Noticing his intense gaze, Elizabeth paused and with a playful smile said, "You seem quite intent on making me nervous with such scrutiny, Mr. Darcy, but I assure you I am not so easily intimidated." Mr. Darcy smiled. "I would never presume to alarm you. We've known each other long enough for you to understand that my intentions are always genuine," he replied. Their banter continued, with Elizabeth teasing him about revealing her flaws to everyone in Hertfordshire. To this, Mr. Darcy simply responded with a knowing grin, appreciating the lively spirit she brought to every conversation. As the evening drew to a close, Lady Catherine once again offered her thoughts on Elizabeth's performance, suggesting that with more practice, and perhaps lessons from a London master, she could truly excel. Elizabeth, ever gracious, listened politely, all the while sharing knowing looks with Mr. Darcy, whose admiration for her was evident, even if his aunt couldn't see it. The evening at Rosings ended with everyone feeling a mix of amusement and admiration, particularly Colonel Fitzwilliam, who found himself more enchanted than ever by the lively and spirited Elizabeth Bennet. Chapter 32. A Tangle of Feelings and Visits. Elizabeth was sitting by herself the next morning, writing to Jane, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were off on business in the village. She was startled by a ring at the door, the certain signal of a visitor. Not hearing a carriage, she thought it might be Lady Catherine, and quickly tucked away her half-finished letter to avoid any nosy questions. But to her great surprise, Mr. Darcy, and only Mr. Darcy, entered the room. He seemed just as surprised to find her alone. "I apologize for intruding, Miss Bennet. I was told all the ladies were at home." Elizabeth quickly collected herself. "No intrusion at all, Mr. Darcy. I was just writing a letter. How is everyone at Rosings?" After the initial pleasantries, an awkward silence threatened to take over. Elizabeth, desperate to keep the conversation going, decided to bring up something from the past. "You all left Netherfield quite suddenly last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been quite a surprise for Mr. Bingley to see you all in London so soon after he left. How are he and his sisters?" "They are perfectly well, thank you," Mr. Darcy replied, offering no further details. Elizabeth waited for more, but when none came, she continued, "I hear Mr. Bingley has no plans to return to Netherfield. Is that true?" "I haven't heard him say so, but it's likely he won't spend much time there. He has many friends and engagements that keep him busy." "If he doesn't plan to return, it might be better for the neighbourhood if he gives up the place. That way, a settled family might take it over. But perhaps Mr. Bingley didn't take the house for the neighbourhood's convenience, but for his own." "I wouldn't be surprised if he gave it up for a suitable purchase," Mr. Darcy said. Elizabeth, cautious of talking too much about his friend, decided to let Mr. Darcy take the lead in their conversation. He took the hint and soon remarked, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine did a lot for it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "Yes, she did, and Mr. Collins is certainly grateful." "Mr. Collins is fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, his friends can be happy he found one of the few sensible women who would accept him and make him happy. My friend has a good understanding, though I'm not sure marrying Mr. Collins was the wisest choice. She seems perfectly happy, though, and it is a prudent match. It must be agreeable for her to be settled so close to her family and friends." "Close? It's nearly 50 miles away." 50 miles of good road is just a half-day's journey. That's quite close." "I would never have considered it an advantage. I wouldn't say Mrs. Collins is settled near her family. That's a sign of your attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond Longbourn must seem far. Elizabeth blushed, thinking he was hinting at Jane and Netherfield. A woman can be too close to her family. Distance is relative and depends on many circumstances. For those with fortune, travel expenses don't matter, but that's not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not enough for frequent journeys. My friend wouldn't consider herself near her family unless the distance was halved. Mr. Darcy moved his chair a little closer. You can't have such strong local attachments. You haven't always been at Longbourn. Elizabeth was surprised by his comment. Sensing a change in his mood, Mr. Darcy drew back, picked up a newspaper, and asked in a cooler tone, "Are you enjoying Kent?" They talked briefly about the countryside until Charlotte and Maria returned. Mr. Darcy explained his unexpected visit, and after a few more minutes of small talk, left. "What do you make of this?" Charlotte asked as soon as he was gone. "Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he wouldn't have called on us like this." Elizabeth recounted his silence, and even Charlotte's hopeful heart found it hard to believe he was in love. They speculated that he might have visited out of sheer boredom. With all field sports over and limited indoor activities, gentlemen needed something to do. From then on, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam visited almost daily, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and occasionally with their aunt. Colonel Fitzwilliam's genuine enjoyment of their company was clear and made him even more endearing. Elizabeth couldn't help comparing him to her former favourite, George Wickham. While Colonel Fitzwilliam lacked Wickham's captivating charm, he seemed to have a better-informed mind. But why Mr. Darcy came so often was a mystery. He often sat in silence and spoke only out of necessity. Charlotte speculated that Mr. Darcy might be in love with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth laughed it off. Charlotte didn't press the matter, fearing to raise false hopes. Instead, she sometimes imagined Elizabeth marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam, who admired her and had a favourable situation in life. However, Mr. Darcy's considerable patronage in the church was a strong counterpoint, making it hard to understand his frequent visits. Chapter 33. Unintended Encounters. More than once, Elizabeth found herself unexpectedly crossing paths with Mr. Darcy during her strolls through the park. She wasn't thrilled about these unplanned meetings, especially since she liked to think of the park as her personal retreat. After their first accidental meeting, she pointedly told him that this was her favourite spot, hoping to avoid any future encounters. Yet, oddly enough, their meetings continued, not just once, but 3 times. It felt almost like fate was playing tricks on her, or perhaps Mr. Darcy was doing this on purpose. Unlike typical brief and awkward exchanges, Mr. Darcy seemed to find reasons to linger, turning back to walk alongside her. Their conversations were usually sparse, with neither of them making much effort to engage. However, during their third encounter, Elizabeth noticed Mr. Darcy asking more personal questions about her stay at Hunsford, her enjoyment of solitude, and her thoughts on Mr. and Mrs. Collins's marital bliss. As they discussed Rosings, Mr. Darcy's comments hinted that he expected Elizabeth would visit Kent again, and perhaps stay at Rosings itself. She wondered if he was thinking about Colonel Fitzwilliam's possible feelings for her. The idea was slightly unsettling, and she was relieved when they reached the gate across from the parsonage. One day, as she was deeply engrossed in a letter from Jane, Elizabeth looked up to find not Mr. Darcy, but Colonel Fitzwilliam approaching. She quickly folded the letter and, masking her surprise with a smile, greeted him. "I didn't realize you walked this path as well." Colonel Fitzwilliam explained that he was concluding his annual tour of the park with a visit to the parsonage. Elizabeth, indicating she was about to head back, turned to walk with him towards her temporary home. Their conversation soon turned to his departure from Kent. "So, you're leaving on Saturday?" she asked. "Yes, unless Darcy delays us again. But really, I'm at his disposal. He tends to arrange these things as he pleases," Colonel Fitzwilliam said with a half-smile. "And he does enjoy that power of choice, doesn't he?" Elizabeth remarked. He does like to have things his way, Colonel Fitzwilliam agreed, chuckling. But don't we all? It's just that he has the means to do so more than most. Their banter continued lightly until Elizabeth teased him about the market price of an earl's younger son, which made them both laugh and effectively ended the topic. Seeking to shift away from a silence that might seem awkward, Elizabeth quipped, "I suppose Darcy brought you here mostly to have someone at his disposal. It's surprising he doesn't just marry to have a constant companion." Colonel Fitzwilliam laughed. "No, that's a role we share when it comes to looking after Miss Darcy. I help him with that." "Really? And how do you find being a guardian? I imagine Miss Darcy can be quite a handful if she's anything like her brother," Elizabeth prodded playfully. He looked at her curiously, then questioned her assumptions about Miss Darcy, prompting Elizabeth to clarify, "Oh, don't worry, I've heard nothing but good things about her. She's quite popular among some ladies I know." Their walk brought them back to more serious topics, as Colonel Fitzwilliam revealed Mr. Darcy had prevented a friend from an imprudent marriage. Elizabeth's interest was piqued, and she questioned him closely, though he was careful not to reveal the friend's identity. The conversation left Elizabeth feeling uneasy about Mr. Darcy's interference in his friend's life. Why did he feel entitled to decide on his friend's happiness? Their discussion trailed off as they reached the parsonage, leaving Elizabeth to reflect on Mr. Darcy's actions, which seemed increasingly driven by pride and a desire to control. That evening her thoughts led to a headache, exacerbated by her agitation over Mr. Darcy's manipulations concerning her sister Jane and Mr. Bingley. As a result, she opted to stay home from an engagement at Rosings, much to Mr. Collins's concern about Lady Catherine's reaction. Mrs. Collins, seeing her genuine discomfort, supported her decision to rest. Chapter 34. Unveiling the Heart. Elizabeth sat alone the next morning, writing a letter to Jane, while Mrs. Collins and Maria were off in the village. She was startled by the doorbell's ring, signalling a visitor. Expecting Lady Catherine, she quickly tucked away her letter to avoid any prying questions. But to her great surprise, it was Mr. Darcy who walked into the room. He seemed equally surprised to find her alone. "I'm sorry for intruding, Miss Bennet. I was told everyone was home." Elizabeth collected herself quickly. "No intrusion at all, Mr. Darcy. How is everyone at Rosings?" After the initial pleasantries, an awkward silence loomed. Desperate to keep the conversation going, Elizabeth brought up a past event. "You all left Netherfield quite suddenly last November, Mr. Darcy. It must have been a surprise for Mr. Bingley to see you all in London so soon after he left. How are he and his sisters?" "They are perfectly well, thank you," Mr. Darcy replied, offering no further details. Elizabeth waited for more, but when none came, she continued, "I hear Mr. Bingley has no plans to return to Netherfield. Is that true?" "I haven't heard him say that, but it's likely he won't spend much time there. He has many friends and engagements that keep him busy. If he doesn't plan to return, it might be better for the neighbourhood if he gives up the place. That way, a settled family might take it over. But perhaps Mr. Bingley didn't take the house for the neighbourhood's convenience, but for his own." "I wouldn't be surprised if he gave it up for a suitable purchase," Mr. Darcy said. Elizabeth, wary of talking too much about his friend, decided to let Mr. Darcy steer the conversation. He took the hint and soon remarked, "This seems a very comfortable house. Lady Catherine did a lot for it when Mr. Collins first came to Hunsford." "Yes, she did. Mr. Collins is certainly grateful." "Mr. Collins is fortunate in his choice of a wife." "Yes, his friends can be happy. He found one of the few sensible women who would accept him and make him happy. My friend has a good understanding, though I'm not sure marrying Mr. Collins was the wisest choice. She seems perfectly happy, though, and it is a prudent match. It must be agreeable for her to be settled so close to her family and friends." "Close? It's nearly 50 miles away." 50 miles of good road is just a half-day's journey. That's quite close." "I would never have considered it an advantage. I wouldn't say Mrs. Collins is settled near her family." "That's a sign of your attachment to Hertfordshire. Anything beyond Longbourn must seem far." Elizabeth blushed, thinking he was hinting at Jane and Netherfield. "A woman can be too close to her family. Distance is relative and depends on many circumstances. For those with fortune, travel expenses don't matter, but that's not the case here. Mr. and Mrs. Collins have a comfortable income, but not enough for frequent journeys. My friend wouldn't consider herself near her family unless the distance was halved. Mr. Darcy moved his chair a little closer. You can't have such strong local attachments. You haven't always been at Longbourn. Elizabeth was surprised by his comment. Sensing a change in his mood, Mr. Darcy drew back, picked up a newspaper, and asked in a cooler tone, "Are you enjoying Kent?" They talked briefly about the countryside until Charlotte and Maria returned. Mr. Darcy explained his unexpected visit and, after a few more minutes of small talk, left. "What do you make of this?" Charlotte asked as soon as he was gone. "Eliza, he must be in love with you, or he wouldn't have called on us like this." Elizabeth recounted his silence, and even Charlotte's hopeful heart found it hard to believe he was in love. They speculated that he might have visited out of sheer boredom. With all field sports over and limited indoor activities, gentlemen needed something to do. From then on, Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam visited almost daily, sometimes separately, sometimes together, and occasionally with their aunt. Colonel Fitzwilliam's genuine enjoyment of their company was clear and made him even more endearing. Elizabeth couldn't help comparing him to her former favourite, George Wickham. While Colonel Fitzwilliam lacked Wickham's captivating charm, he seemed to have a better informed mind. But why Mr. Darcy came so often was a mystery. He often sat in silence and spoke only out of necessity. Charlotte speculated that Mr. Darcy might be in love with Elizabeth, but Elizabeth laughed it off. Charlotte didn't press the matter, fearing to raise false hopes. Instead, she sometimes imagined Elizabeth marrying Colonel Fitzwilliam, who admired her and had a favourable situation in life. However, Mr. Darcy's considerable patronage in the church was a strong counterpoint, making it hard to understand his frequent visits. Chapter 35. Unexpected Revelations. Elizabeth awoke the next morning, still grappling with the surprise of the previous day's events. She couldn't think of anything else. Feeling too restless for any kind of work, she decided to go for a walk after breakfast. She headed for her favourite path, but the memory of Mr. Darcy sometimes walking there made her change her mind. Instead, she turned up the lane that led away from the main road. As she walked along the park's boundary, she soon passed one of its gates. The fresh morning air and the sight of the budding trees tempted her to stop and gaze into the park. Just as she was about to continue her walk, she spotted a figure moving through the grove. Fearing it was Mr. Darcy, she turned to retreat, but the person saw her and called out her name. Elizabeth hesitated, but recognized Mr. Darcy's voice. She turned back toward the gate, and he reached it just as she did, holding out a letter. "I've been walking here hoping to meet you. Would you do me the honor of reading this letter?" he said, with a composed but haughty look. Then, with a slight bow, he turned and disappeared into the grove. Curiosity got the better of her, and she opened the letter. To her surprise, it was several pages long. She started reading as she walked back along the lane. Rosings, 8 o'clock in the morning. "Don't be alarmed, madam, on receiving this letter, thinking it contains a repetition of last night's sentiments. I write without any intention of causing you pain or humbling myself. My character demands this explanation. You accuse me of 2 offences, separating Mr. Bingley from your sister and ruining Mr. Wickham. Let me explain my actions and their motives. I had not been long in Hertfordshire before I noticed Bingley's preference for your sister, but it wasn't until the Netherfield ball that I suspected a serious attachment. Sir William Lucas mentioned their marriage as a certain event. I watched them closely and saw Bingley's affection, but I didn't see any special regard from your sister. If I was wrong, I am sincerely sorry, but your sister's behaviour suggested indifference. My objections to their marriage were not only due to the disparity in connections, but also the impropriety often displayed by your mother, younger sisters, and occasionally your father. While you and your elder sister are praised for your conduct, the rest of your family often behaved in ways that were concerning. Bingley left for London the day after the ball, intending to return. His sisters and I agreed that separating him from your sister was best. I emphasized your sister's indifference, and Bingley, modest and reliant on my judgment, believed me. I regret concealing her presence in London from him, but I thought it necessary. Regarding Mr. Wickham, he is the son of a man who managed the Pemberley estates. My father supported him at school and Cambridge, intending him for the church, but Wickham's behaviour revealed his lack of principles. He sought a financial settlement instead of a church position, which I granted. His subsequent life of idleness and dissipation proved my judgment right. Last summer, Wickham attempted to elope with my sister Georgiana to secure her fortune. Fortunately, I discovered their plan, and she confessed everything to me. Wickham's main goal was her money, but he also sought revenge on me. This is a true account of our interactions. If you doubt my words, you can confirm them with Colonel Fitzwilliam, who knows all the details. I hope this letter clarifies my actions and absolves me of any perceived cruelty toward Mr. Wickham. I had to write this letter to clear my name. God bless you. Fitzwilliam Darcy. Elizabeth's emotions swirled as she read the letter. Mr. Darcy's explanation of his actions regarding Jane and Mr. Wickham was startling. She had despised him for separating Jane and Bingley and for his treatment of Wickham. Now she learned there was another side to the story. She continued to read, feeling a mix of confusion and realization. By the end of the letter, she understood Mr. Darcy's perspective, but wasn't sure if she could forgive him. The letter painted a complex picture of his character, one that she had never considered. As Elizabeth returned to the house, she was overwhelmed by the tumult of her thoughts. Mr. Darcy's letter had upended her understanding of the man and the events that had transpired. She needed time to process everything and decide what to do next. Chapter 36. Revelations in a Letter. Elizabeth had no idea what to expect when Mr. Darcy handed her the letter. She certainly didn't anticipate it being a renewal of his proposals. With a mix of reluctance and curiosity, she broke the seal, and as she read, her emotions swirled, a tumultuous blend of surprise, anger, and disbelief. Initially, she was amazed that Mr. Darcy believed he could offer any apology that would suffice, convinced that a just sense of shame should prevent him from trying to explain. But as she delved into the contents, starting with his recount of events at Netherfield, her disbelief grew. She read hungrily, each sentence fueling her impatience and frustration, particularly his assertions about her sister's indifference, which she immediately dismissed as false. Mr. Darcy's recounting lacked any hint of regret, his tone more haughty than penitent. It struck her as nothing but pride and insolence. However, the narrative took a sharp turn as he began to describe Mr. Wickham's character. This section, which detailed events eerily similar to Mr. Darcy's own past dealings with Wickham, if true, threatened to dismantle every favourable impression she had held of Wickham. Despite her initial resistance, exclaiming internally, "This must be false! This cannot be!" Elizabeth found herself grappling with the possibility of its truth. As she forced herself to continue, the details of Wickham's departure from the Pemberley estate and his acceptance of money in lieu of a promised living contradicted the deceptive narrative Wickham had shared with her. The stark discrepancy between the stories forced her to confront the likely duplicity on Wickham's part. With a heavy heart, she reread the letter, striving for impartiality. But the more she read, the clearer it became that Mr. Darcy might actually be blameless in their past misunderstandings. The accusations he levelled against Wickham, detailing a history of profligacy and deceit, deeply disturbed her, especially as she could not refute them with any proof of her own. Her previous admiration for Wickham was based solely on his charm and the seemingly virtuous stories he'd shared during their first meeting. Now, recalling his inconsistent behaviour and his avoidance of Mr. Darcy, she began to see the potential truth in Mr. Darcy's words. The realization that Wickham might have manipulated her opinion so effectively was humbling and embarrassing. As she reflected on the information Colonel Fitzwilliam had inadvertently confirmed just that morning, her trust in Wickham faltered completely. Everything Wickham had told her about Mr. Darcy and his actions now appeared in a different light, tainted by the possibility of his own selfish motives. Struggling with these revelations, Elizabeth walked for hours, wrestling with her thoughts and emotions. The weight of her misjudgment pressed heavily upon her, leading her to question not only Wickham's integrity, but her own discernment. "How despicably I have acted," she lamented internally. "Vanity, not love, has been my folly." As she returned home, weary and introspective, she learned that both Mr. Darcy and Colonel Fitzwilliam had visited during her absence. Mr. Darcy had only stayed briefly to bid them farewell, which piqued her curiosity, but it was Colonel Fitzwilliam's longer visit that she missed. Yet, in the state she was in, she could only feign disappointment at missing him. Her mind was wholly consumed by the letter and its profound implications on her understanding of Mr. Darcy, Mr. Wickham, and herself. Chapter 37. Reflections and Departures. The next morning, the two gentlemen left Rosings. Mr. Collins, eager to bid them farewell, waited by the lodges. He was pleased to report that they appeared in good health and spirits, despite the recent melancholy events at Rosings. He then hurried to Lady Catherine's side to console her and Miss de Bourgh. Upon his return, he carried with great satisfaction an invitation for them all to dine with her ladyship. Elizabeth couldn't think of Lady Catherine without imagining what her reaction might have been if she were introduced as her future niece. She amused herself with thoughts of Lady Catherine's possible indignation. Lady Catherine began by expressing how much she felt the loss of her guests. "I assure you, I feel it exceedingly. I believe nobody feels the loss of friends as deeply as I do. I am particularly attached to these young men. They are so fond of me. They were excessively sorry to go, especially Darcy. He seemed to feel it more acutely than last year. His attachment to Rosings certainly grows." Mr. Collins threw in a compliment, which Lady Catherine and Miss de Bourgh kindly acknowledged. After dinner, Lady Catherine noted Elizabeth's subdued mood and immediately attributed it to her impending departure. "If you're unhappy about leaving so soon, you must write to your mother and ask to stay longer. Mrs. Collins would be glad to have your company, I'm sure." "I appreciate your kindness, Lady Catherine, but I must be in town next Saturday." "Why, that's only 6 weeks. I expected you to stay 2 months. Your mother can surely spare you another fortnight." "But my father cannot. He wrote last week asking me to hurry back." "Oh, fathers can spare their daughters if the mothers can. Daughters are never as important to fathers. If you stay another month, I can take one of you to London in early June. Dawson won't mind the barouche box, so there's plenty of room, and if it's cool, I might take both of you, as you're neither of you large." "You're very kind, madam, but we must stick to our original plan." Lady Catherine seemed resigned. "Mrs. Collins, you must send a servant with them. I can't bear the idea of 2 young women travelling alone. It's highly improper. You must send someone. Young women should always be properly guarded and attended, according to their situation in life. When my niece Georgiana went to Ramsgate last summer, I made sure she had 2 men servants. Miss Darcy, the daughter of Mr. Darcy of Pemberley, couldn't appear properly otherwise. You must send John with them, Mrs. Collins. I'm glad I thought to mention it. It would be discreditable to let them go alone." "My uncle is sending a servant for us." "Oh, your uncle keeps a manservant? I'm glad someone thinks of these things. Where will you change horses? Oh, Bromley, of course. If you mention my name at the bell, you'll be well taken care of." Lady Catherine had many more questions about their journey, which Elizabeth was relieved to answer, as it kept her mind occupied. When she was alone, however, she indulged in the unpleasant reflections that had been plaguing her. Mr. Darcy's letter was now almost memorized. She studied every sentence, her feelings toward him shifting frequently. She was still indignant about his proposal, but felt guilty for misjudging him. His disappointment elicited compassion, his affection gratitude, and his character respect. Yet she could not approve of him, nor regret her refusal. Elizabeth's concerns for her family added to her distress. Her father laughed off the wild behaviour of her younger sisters, and her mother was oblivious to their impropriety. Elizabeth and Jane tried to curb Catherine and Lydia's imprudence, but with their mother's indulgence, improvement was unlikely. Catherine, weak-willed and easily led by Lydia, was always offended by advice. Lydia, headstrong and careless, ignored it altogether. Anxiety over Jane's situation was another constant worry. Mr. Darcy's explanation restored Bingley's good opinion in Elizabeth's eyes, making Jane's loss even more grievous. Jane had been deprived of a promising and advantageous match by her family's folly. Wickham's true character added to Elizabeth's dismay, affecting her spirits to the point where cheerfulness was nearly impossible. Their engagements at Rosings were as frequent as ever during Elizabeth's last week. On the final evening, Lady Catherine once again inquired into the particulars of their journey and gave detailed packing instructions. Maria, feeling obliged, repacked her trunk. When they parted, Lady Catherine wished them a good journey with great condescension and invited them to return next year. Mr. Bore even managed a curtsy and extended her hand to both Elizabeth and Maria. Chapter 38. Farewell to Hunsford. On that brisk Saturday morning, Elizabeth and Mr. Collins found themselves alone for breakfast a few minutes before the others joined. Mr. Collins, ever the gracious host, seized the moment to extend his parting civilities. "Miss Elizabeth," he began, his tone earnest, "I'm not sure if my wife has mentioned this, but we're deeply grateful for your visit. We understand our humble home doesn't hold the attractions of larger estates, and we appreciate the kindness you've shown by staying with us." Elizabeth responded with genuine warmth, expressing how much she enjoyed her time at Hunsford, especially the company of her dear friend Charlotte. Mr. Collins, visibly pleased, continued, "I'm delighted to hear you've been comfortable. We've certainly tried our best to introduce you to the finer circles, thanks to our connection with Rosings. I trust your stay wasn't too dull, given our frequent visits there." As he rambled on about the blessings of their connection to Lady Catherine, Elizabeth managed to balance politeness with sincerity in her response. "You can certainly count on me to speak well of my time here in Hertfordshire," she assured him, even though inwardly she planned to keep some opinions to herself. Mr. Collins beamed with satisfaction. "And let me say, Miss Elizabeth, I sincerely wish you all the happiness in your future, much like the felicity Charlotte and I have found in our marriage. We are quite the perfect match." Elizabeth agreed that finding such harmony in marriage was indeed a blessing. Their exchange was interrupted by Charlotte's arrival, which Elizabeth was secretly relieved about. It was bittersweet to leave her friend in such simple surroundings, but Charlotte had made her choice knowingly and seemed content managing her household and parish duties. Soon the carriage was ready, loaded with their trunks and parcels. After heartfelt goodbyes, Mr. Collins escorted Elizabeth to the carriage, peppering their walk with reminders of his gratitude toward her family and compliments to the gardeners. Just as Elizabeth and her cousin Maria were about to depart, Mr. Collins, in a sudden fluster, remembered they had not left any messages for the ladies of Rosings. "You'll want to send them your respects and thanks for their kindness during your stay," he said quickly. Elizabeth agreed without hesitation, and with a final nod, the carriage door was closed, and they were on their way. Maria, struck by the whirlwind of their visit, exclaimed, "Good gracious! It feels like we just arrived, and now so much has happened." "A great many things indeed," Elizabeth replied softly, thinking to herself, "and so much I must keep to myself." The ride to Mr. Gardiner's house was quiet and uneventful. They arrived within 4 hours, welcomed by the sight of a healthy-looking Jane. While their aunt had planned several activities, Elizabeth knew the true conversation would come once they were back at Longbourn. There, she would finally have the chance to tell Jane about Mr. Darcy's unexpected proposal. The thought of sharing such news with Jane was thrilling yet daunting. Elizabeth was tempted by the prospect of revealing such a secret, which would certainly astonish her sister and perhaps stroke her own ego. However, she wrestled with how much to disclose, especially concerning Mr. Bingley not wanting to reopen her sister's wounds. As the carriage rolled on, Elizabeth felt a mix of excitement and apprehension about the discussions to come, knowing they would stir both delight and drama in equal measure. Chapter 39. Reunions and Revelations. It was the second week in May when Elizabeth, Jane, and Maria set out from Gracechurch Street for Hertfordshire. As they approached the inn, where Mr. Bennet's carriage was to meet them, they spotted Kitty and Lydia eagerly watching from an upstairs window. The two had been there for over an hour, busily visiting a milliner's shop, watching the guard, and preparing a salad. As they welcomed their sisters, Kitty and Lydia triumphantly displayed a table set with cold meats. "Isn't this nice? Such a delightful surprise," Lydia beamed. "We mean to treat you all, but you'll have to lend us the money since we spent ours at the shop." She proudly showed off her new bonnet. "I don't think it's very pretty, but I bought it anyway. I'll tear it apart and see if I can make it better." When her sisters critiqued the bonnet, Lydia shrugged. "Oh, there were uglier ones at the shop. I'll get some prettier satin to trim it with, and it'll do. Besides, it won't matter what we wear once the regiment leaves Meryton in a fortnight." "Are they really leaving?" Elizabeth asked, unable to hide her satisfaction. "Yes, they're heading to Brighton. I want Papa to take us there for the summer. It'd be so fun, and Mamma would love it too. Just imagine how boring our summer will be otherwise." Elizabeth thought, Brighton and a camp full of soldiers. That would be a disaster, considering how the militia and Meryton's monthly balls have already turned our lives upside down. As they sat down to eat, Lydia announced, "I have some exciting news about someone we all like." Jane and Elizabeth exchanged curious glances, and Lydia continued, "It's about dear Wickham. Mary King has gone to stay with her uncle in Liverpool. Wickham is safe." "And so is Mary King," added Elizabeth. "Safe from an imprudent match." "She's a fool for leaving if she liked him," Lydia retorted. Jane hoped, "I pray there wasn't a strong attachment on either side." "There wasn't on his part, for sure. He never cared about her. Who could care for such a freckled little thing?" Elizabeth felt a pang of guilt, realizing that her own feelings toward Wickham had once been similarly harsh. After they finished eating and paid, the carriage was brought around. With some effort, they managed to fit everyone and their luggage inside. "Look how nicely we're crammed in," Lydia laughed. "I'm glad I brought my bonnet, even if just for the fun of having another hat box. Now let's be comfortable and chat all the way home. Tell us what's happened since you've been gone. Any flirtations? I hope one of you would have snagged a husband by now. Jane will be an old maid soon. She's almost 23. My Aunt Phillips is eager for you to marry. She thinks Lizzie should have married Mr. Collins, but I wouldn't find that fun. I'd love to marry first, so I can chaperone you all to balls." Lydia then shared a story about dressing up Colonel Forster's friend Chamberlain in women's clothes to fool their friends at a dance. "It was such a laugh! No one recognized him until they realized what was going on. Even Mrs. Forster and I almost died laughing." Throughout the journey, Lydia entertained them with tales of parties and jokes, with Kitty adding her own comments. Elizabeth listened as little as possible, trying to avoid hearing Wickham's name. Back at Longbourn, they were warmly welcomed. Mrs. Bennet was delighted to see Jane looking as lovely as ever, and Mr. Bennet said to Elizabeth more than once during dinner, "I'm glad you're back, Lizzie." Their party in the dining room was large, as almost all the Lucases came to meet Maria and hear the latest news. Lady Lucas inquired after her daughter's welfare and poultry, while Mrs. Bennet eagerly collected and relayed the latest fashions from Jane to the younger Miss Lucases. Lydia loudly recounted the morning's pleasures to anyone who would listen. "Oh, Mary, I wish you had come with us. We had such fun. Kitty and I pulled up all the blinds in the coach and pretended no one was inside. We treated everyone to the nicest cold lunch, and we would have treated you too. We laughed so much on the way home, anyone could have heard us a mile off." Mary replied gravely, "Far be it from me to depreciate such pleasures. They might appeal to many, but I prefer a good book." Lydia, hardly listening, urged the girls to walk to Meryton that afternoon to catch up with everyone. Elizabeth opposed the idea, not wanting it said that the Bennet sisters couldn't stay home for half a day without chasing after officers. She also dreaded seeing Wickham and was relieved the regiment would be leaving soon. Once they were gone, she hoped to be free from any more trouble caused by him. She hadn't been home long before she realised Lydia's idea of spending the summer in Brighton was a frequent topic between her parents. Elizabeth saw that her father had no intention of agreeing, but his vague and equivocal answers left her mother hopeful of success. Chapter 40. Heartfelt Confidences. As the morning light filtered through the windows at Longbourn, Elizabeth found herself unable to contain her urgency to share with Jane the events that had transpired. Deciding to keep details concerning her sister out of the narrative, she prepared Jane for a surprise and delved into recounting her intense encounter with Mr. Darcy. Jane listened with a mix of astonishment and sisterly bias, her initial shock quickly giving way to empathy. "It's unfortunate Mr. Darcy expressed himself in such a manner. It's not conducive to making a favourable impression," Jane said softly, her concern for Elizabeth evident. "And I can only imagine how his heart must ache from your refusal." "Indeed," Elizabeth replied, her voice tinged with regret. "I feel for him truly, but he seems to have other concerns that might soon overshadow his regard for me. You don't think poorly of me for refusing him, do you?" "Blame you? Oh no, Lizzie. But perhaps you think less of me for speaking so ill of Mr. Wickham?" Elizabeth ventured cautiously. Jane hesitated, then answered, "No, I believe you spoke from conviction at the time." Elizabeth nodded, then shared the contents of Mr. Darcy's revealing letter about Wickham, which painted a vastly different picture of the man they thought they knew. Jane was deeply distressed, unable to reconcile the existence of such deceit in a person they had both liked. "This is troubling indeed," Jane sighed, her voice filled with disappointment. "How can one reconcile such conflicting accounts of two gentlemen?" Elizabeth, with a wry smile, responded, "It seems there's only enough virtue between them to make one respectable gentleman. For now, I'm more inclined to believe Mr. Darcy's side of the story, but you must draw your own conclusions." It took a while for Jane to manage even a small smile, her mind reeling from the revelations. "I'm shocked, truly. Mr. Wickham seemed so genuine. And poor Mr. Darcy. To endure such heartbreak, and then to deal with the slander against his sister, it's all quite distressing." Elizabeth, trying to lighten the mood, quipped, "If you keep pitying him so, I'll have to start feeling cheerful to balance it out." Their conversation turned to whether they should expose Wickham's true nature to the community. Jane, ever considerate, suggested caution. Exposing him might only lead to despair and ruin for him, which he may already regret. Elizabeth agreed, deciding to keep Mr. Darcy's disclosures to herself. The weight of keeping such secrets was eased by sharing them with Jane, yet there remained details she dared not divulge, not yet, not until the whole truth of her feelings and Mr. Darcy's intentions could be openly discussed without causing harm. As their dialogue shifted to more mundane matters, Mrs. Bennet entered, eager to discuss the prospects of Jane's broken engagement and the Collins household management. Elizabeth listened, her thoughts drifting between her sister's unspoken sorrow and the complexities of her own entangled affections. In the safety of Jane's understanding, Elizabeth found a precious confidant, but even with her beloved sister, there were truths she was not yet ready to share. The emotional landscape of her heart remained a private garden, where not all paths could be walked together.